close. And that's a sign of a sincere smile. Another sincerity thing is if people are using their forehead a lot when they smile, the forehead should be totally relaxed when they're smiling. But you see people forcing to smile and they're overusing their forehead. That's a sign of insincerity. That's a very common.
But talk about how I tell whether you're going to cheat me or lie to me or do anything that might injure me or my family.
That's the number one subject people want to learn about is deception detection, lie detection. And there's no one sign that always tells whether a person is lying. And there's some modest exceptions for that. I mentioned earlier in the week an example where a husband and wife are married or a couple spending a lot of time around each other, and there's say an example of a lady who touched her nose in a certain way whenever she was telling a known white lie to her partner, to a third party. He had normed her, and that's a term, that's her norm when she tells a white lie, so well that perhaps there are some settings where you can put a lot more confidence in one thing like that. But any self-touching, especially towards the front of the head and the upper chest and neck area, those are called manipulators or adapters. Any self-touching anywhere in the body, but especially in that area, when they go up, there's a sign that that person has a lot of anxiety, which is not always a lie, but when you see the number of them per minute go up, that's a sign that often people are lying. And so again, you want to steer the conversation that direction. What was it at that moment that gave that person anxiety? So you revisit that and kind of talk about that a little more, and you see the anxiety goes up. Another thing is the blink rate. There's well-known politicians that have, during lies they've told on camera, that retrospectively we all know are lies, where their blink rate went up 5-8 times normal. And it's normal to blink about every 6 or 8 seconds, but these people are blinking like this. When your pupils dilate, and I'm in a bright area right now, so it's difficult for my pupils to dilate, and it's a difficult thing to see, especially in a darker room or people when they have darker eyes. But in the acute moment of a lie, your pupils will tend to dilate when you're lying. There are a bunch of other causes for pupil dilation. It's a difficult thing to notice, and it's difficult to put in context. Another thing you want to look for, these movements that we use, these are called illustrators, where it's not, your hands are out here in this area roughly, and we're using them to illustrate or punctuate or underline conversation. If I'm using a lot of those, or an average amount, and you say, oh, he uses his hands about this amount, and all of a sudden they drop off, and I'm not illustrating at all, I'm not using my hands at all, that's a sign that my brain has to think more about lying. And so if those all of a sudden drop off, and then maybe a minute or two later when we get on a more comfortable subject, they pick up again, you should think, okay, during that moment we were talking about this touchy subject and he wasn't using his hands, that's a good sign that I might be fibbing.
Okay, let me give you...
Other things to look for are different eye movements. If I'm asking you to recall something from the past, and if you're right-handed, this is switched for left-handed people, and I'm asking you to recall something from the past, something that happened yesterday, you're going to tend 90% of the time to look up to your left. If I ask you about something, were you there yesterday, or hey, did you see this? If you're not looking up to your left, that's one sign. And if I'm asking you to maybe speculate about something in the future, you're going to tend to look up to the right. So that's when you're visually constructing something. So if you know what direction the eyes are looking in the context of what question, you can tell lies that way too. That's kind of a difficult thing to do. All
right, I'm out at dinner with either my girlfriend or my wife, and they're about to call an end to our relationship. What is it that they say and how is it that they act that I should look for?
Well, I'd probably steer you a couple weeks or a couple months earlier, depending on how long you're going out with this person, so you could see it coming. That would be my advice to you there if I had my little time machine, but I would do that, because if you see these warning signs, sometimes obviously you can circumvent the problem, and that's the whole idea. There are people that have studied longevity of relationships and spent their lifetime doing that. And the number one predictor of relationship failure, whether it's a long-term boyfriend, girlfriend, or marriage, is the display of contempt. So if contempt is displayed, there's a very, very high likelihood that the relationship's going to end. And contempt has a particular facial expression. It's got several, but one in particular. It's the only asymmetric one that's universal, and it's a kind of a snarl, a one-sided snarl. And that's the exaggerated, And it's interesting how anyone can spot that. And they might not label contempt, but they say that's a negative emotion. He's angry. She's distraught. They'll label it as a negative emotion, but contempt is when I'm putting you down and putting myself up here. But when people display contempt, it's extremely a bad warning sign. Another sign of contempt is when the center forehead contracts, and yet there's a smile down here. Those two things are in disparity. When the center forehead contracts, it's almost always a sign of physical pain or psychological pain. So you shouldn't see a smile. But if you see a smile here and the center forehead contract like that, those are in disparity. That's another sign of contempt and looking down upon you. So if you start to see that emotion or that display, that's a sign of. Well, that can certainly happen in the last half of a relationship. Say a marriage lasts for 5 years, that you start to see that in the last half. Hugs are a great example. If a hug becomes less intimate, and you can tell that often by several things, how close the hips are together. A person might do just a side hug, kind of a shoulder hug, but if it's a frontal hug, the further the hips are apart, the less romance there is there. Even when your feet aren't, or your hips aren't pointed to the person, but you're hugging them kind of sideways, kind of an amalgam between those two. Those are big things. Cuddling, and when a couple starts to have a fracture in the relationship, the thing that'll separate first when they're cuddling is their feet. Or if your husband or wife gives you a foot rub and they say, honey, don't touch my feet, they're just sensitive now. I don't like foot rubs anymore. That's a sign. It's interesting how people, in a way, it's one of the more intimate areas of the body. We don't think of it in the classic way, but if you don't want your feet touched, that's a sign.
What else should I look for in the breakup of a relationship?
A lot less eye contact. Eye contact is a big one. Eye contact when someone, when someone says, I love you, you want to know, are they telling the truth? But eye contact has a lot to do with that. It's normal in Western society. Eye contact should be between 30 and 70% of the time, and towards the higher end of that, if you really want to bond with someone, even if it's just a business negotiation. But if the eye contact drops off a lot,